Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. I'm the host of the Natasha Helfer podcast, and I am coming to you today solo to talk about an issue that came up for me over the spring that I've been wanting to address and been thinking about intentionally for some time, because I want to be careful about my own biases and my own kind of, framework, my own feelings, and all those things when I address this issue. So I recently presented back in May of 2023 at the UAMFT annual conference. That's the Utah Association for Marriage and Family Therapists. I was their keynote speaker, and that was like a total honor. It's a total privilege to be asked to do that. I was really touched, and was like really excited to do this. I've been a member of AAMFT, which is the national organization, my entire professional career. I'm an LMFT or an MFT trained by practice. That's my professional home. I have served on many boards and committees throughout my time as a therapist. I've lobbied in Washington, D.C., and also at many state capitals for issues surrounding mental health parity, allowing MFTs to be considered as providers in VAs, and also in public school systems. I was even the president of the Kansas division of AMFT for a term. So this is definitely my professional home. So to be asked to be the keynote speaker here in Utah this year was a true honor. And I was asked to speak on a fairly controversial topic. The board told me that there seems to be a lot of inherent kind of cultural and political and religious bias in this geographical area, specifically tied to how therapists show up with their clients, which I agree. That's also been a concern of mine since the onset of my career. I've lived that in evangelical spaces and conservative Christian spaces, and definitely here in my own kind of Latter-day Saint home with the people that I come from. I've lived primarily in religiously conservative geographical spaces, and I've seen the ethical dilemmas that come up for therapists and clients when it comes to these philosophical, religious, or political differences. So I was more than willing to approach this topic. I think sometimes people think of mental health as somehow divided from these issues. Like if you're dealing with depression or anxiety, why would it matter what political party you belong to or things like that? But what I started realizing pretty quickly is that you may be dealing with things as common as depression and anxiety for reasons that are tied to your faith community or your political leanings or things of that nature. So they are definitely intertwined, like most things in life. So we can't divorce them and we can't ignore them. And these biases exist and they show up in all different kinds of ways. So I called my keynote, I called it Politics, Religion, and Sex, talking about the unspeakable, managing the intersections between faith, sexuality, and evidence-based practice. Given this topic, politics, religion, and sex, I knew I was biting off a lot to chew. And I figured my presentation would get a mixed reception from the attendees, which I did. The presentation was definitely organized towards a Utah population since I was, presenting to the Utah organization. And so I started off by sharing just kind of some statistics about the state of Utah. We've got almost 3 million people. We're like the fourth fastest growing state. It's a sparsely populated state with 80% of its residents surrounding the Salt Lake City metropolitan area. In the state, 73% affiliate as Christian, 4% as non-Christian, and 18% is not religious. And Salt Lake City is the world headquarters for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with about 61% of Utahns identifying as members. And whether or not you're a member of the church, we do have a very large influence, or the church has a very large influence on culture, on government, on kind of legal things that happen, and even lifestyle. When it came to race, we are a fairly white state. 85% identify as white, 5% identify as other. We've got 2% identifying as Asian, 4% identifying as 2 or more races. We have 1% identifying as Black or African American, 1% identifying as Native American, and 1% identifying as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. So it's a predominantly white state, and it is one of the lowest Black population percentages in the nation, ranking 43rd of 50 states. And it is one of the highest percentages of Hispanic residents in relation to total population, ranking 12th out of 50 states. So I started with this. I asked the audience to stand if they were comfortable as I asked about the demographics of the participants. So some of the questions I asked was, if you're a member or consider yourself a member of the predominant religion here in Utah, so the mainstream church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'd be willing to bet about 90% of the room stood up. And this was a room of maybe about, I don't know exactly, but I'm going to guess about 300 to 400 people, plus there were people that were listening online as well. When I asked about who would identify in other religious groups, any other religion, about 10 people stood up in the room. And when I asked if anyone was comfortable identifying as an atheist or agnostic, 1 person stood up out of that entire room. 2 therapists were willing to stand up when I asked about whether or not anybody had been excommunicated by the predominant religion. About 5 people stood up when I asked about being BIPOC, and about 10 to 12 people stood up when I asked if they identified as part of being the LGBTQ community. So this shows how obviously the room that I was presenting pretty much kind of matched the Utah demographics, except for there was a lot more people who identified as Latter-day Saint in that room than the 60% that it sounds like Utah is currently identifying as. Okay, so you can see that the population was primarily LDS and it was primarily white. So the way I structured the keynote was to take my professional timeline, so I made it fairly personal, and give a history of the many ethical quandaries I found myself navigating from the very get-go of my career, which started in 1997. It really started in 1995, because that's when I started going to graduate school. And there were issues there as well that I started facing. But let's just say 1997, that I do not feel that I was adequately prepared by my field to ethically address. Not because my graduate program wasn't a great program. It actually really was. It definitely taught me the foundations of marriage and family therapy theory and practice. And I've always been very pleased with that. But I just don't feel like these ethical issues that I'm about to bring up really are addressed in any or most graduate programs, because it really lies at this intersection of therapist bias and so many positions that we may take. And although we are taught in basic ethics to not allow our own biases to, show up in the therapy room, it still happens quite frequently and in ways that I don't know that we've ever been taught to consider. So just a sampling of what this keynote addressed as far as the many issues I was dealing with from being a baby therapist all the way till now is LGBTQ concerns in highly religious communities, the realities of conversion therapy, being very alive and well, and in fact, actually being trained to be a conversion therapy by LDS Family Services, LGBTQ concerns in regards to mixed orientation marriages, working with gender roles not conducive to marital health, but they are supported by the client's faith paradigm, sexual shame, sexual behavior seen as sin and then codified as illness by religious mental health practitioners, having therapists leave AMFT when they publicly supported gay marriage and gay parenting, which AMFT was one of the first entities to do that, stark misinformation about sexual media, especially explicit sexual media, the biases even of leading professionals towards monogamy being the only healthy and emotionally intelligent choice, the explosion of the inaccurate and ineffective model of sex addiction theory led by Patrick Carnes, the reality that many Christian and LDS therapists belong to mental health associations such as the Christian Mental Health Association or the AMCAP here in Utah, that are led that basically go explicitly against our professional codes of ethics and ask providers to practice therapy in ways that would align with their religious values instead of professional ethics. Treating normative sexual behavior, something as simple as masturbation, as clinically problematic. Working with trans clients and gender identity concerns, which we're seeing a huge explosion of that today. This is a very applicable issue today of therapists who are misinformed and not following WPATH guidelines. So I brought that up. Asexual legitimacy, BDSM and kink legitimacy, being affirming of sex workers, not weaponizing trauma or attachment theories through religious bias. The reality is that most of our psychological theories and our ideas of professionalism being very much impacted by white supremacy, right? It's most of the people you think about, like, Rogers and Freud and Erickson. I mean, they're all white patriarchs that we have followed through the psychological field. It's not like the psychological field wasn't, found in other cultures or other ethnicities, but that's what rose to the top, which is what is meant by the white supremacy piece of that. So I really brought it, right? Every single issue I've had to look at from my own bias, every single issue I've once had to sit with, a lot of my own discomfort, I brought it up. And I know that my colleagues have had to face these issues as well, or are refusing to face these issues. I also shared at the beginning quite a bit of what is called my social location, which is a term that denotes how you situate yourself in the world in regards to power dynamics, especially in regards to race, culture, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability status, relational status, parenting status, right? And I did that as really providing an example of the importance of being clinically aware of power differentials and dynamics you may have with your clients. If I'm a cis straight therapist and I'm sitting across the room from a queer Black client and I'm white, there's going to be a lot of intersections of power dynamics that are in the room. And how we were trained originally as therapists was to kind of be a blank slate and to not bring those things up and to not bring anything about yourself to the room. And what we're finding through a lot of great research being done, especially in social justice theories, is that minorities in particular feel very threatened by that. And it doesn't provide safe clinical spaces. They need the therapist to, disclose some aspects of themselves and to signal that they are a safe place for some of these minorities and the issues that they're dealing with. So naming my social location kind of gave me an opportunity to name some of the lived experiences I've had, how I was coming into this keynote, how I identify maybe where there are gaps in knowledge and my awareness, and especially in anti-racism spaces, it is often pointed out that we as white people do not name our whiteness, and that contributes to this idea that we are the norm. Okay, so I could talk about this keynote on a much wider spectrum. I could talk about this probably for many hours, but today I want to address something that happened about half an hour in, which was the discomfort around my use of the word Mormon, or the words Mormon and Mormonism. And I was critiqued and called out as having been guilty of being microaggressive to the LDS folks in the room. And that was a really interesting critique for me to listen to, and I definitely want to take that critique seriously, and I want to address it. And this is kind of my first maybe public way of doing that. And I'd really love insight from anybody who wants to offer insight on this issue. So I think I made some assumptions I should not have made going into that keynote, because most of you know that I was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints back in 2021, and that was a very painful experience for me personally. It had a lot to do with my professional advocacy and my positions that are not aligned with current church leaders and current understandings of how LDS gospel doctrine should be interpreted. And yet I've been pretty open that I still identify as Mormon, that's my identity, right? And again, remember, I was giving a lot of this information from a personal lens. I talked about being, a Mormon woman, following a career paths, a lot of my social location, that my parents converted to Mormonism, etc. So I was telling of my story, I did use the word Mormon versus Latter-day Saint. And I realized pretty quickly that even though I still identified myself that way, that because of this excommunication process, my colleagues and counterparts were not identifying myself as part of the in group, that I was really being treated and considered as other, because it's hard to give the microaggressive critique if you're part of the group who's being microaggressed, right? And I oftentimes talk about this kind of like in family systems, right? Like, I can talk crap about my brother all day long, but if you talk crap about my brother and you're not part of my family, then, you're going to have to deal with me, right? And so it's very normal, of course, to be on the defense, especially if you're a minority group, to the attacks of other people and the critiques of other people. But if you're part of that group, I don't think that the term microaggression really is applicable, because then it's just kind of differences of opinion within the in-group and how they manage issues amongst themselves. So I realized I was being seen as other, and that even though I was talking about my identity, that identity wasn't really being, I don't know if respected is the word, or honored, whatever that was. I also realized that I was coming at that word from a much larger cultural context, right? So I was seeing my address talking about all different kinds of people who have once been Mormon, have once been part of the mainstream church, who are part of other churches that don't have anything to do with the mainstream church. And so many people may not identify with the word Latter-day Saint. And I realized that many of the participants there were not coming to that language with that at least understanding. And if it was one mistake I made that I really do agree with, is that I should have made that clear from the get-go. I should have had a slide kind of explaining the words I was going to use and why I was going to use them. And that was definitely a mistake on my part. But the reality is that, when we look at the quote unquote Mormon population, you do have current believing active Latter-day Saints who very much identify with being called LDS or Latter-day Saint, and do their due diligence of naming the entire church's name. And that's very important to them and to their identity. You also have a huge post-Mormon or ex-Mormon population that would not identify with the term LDS at all. And in fact, have very strong feelings about these name changes that have happened fairly recently, like in the last 5 to 10 years. You also have, I've talked to many progressive or historically minded active Latter-day Saints that are very historically tied to their pioneer heritage, to their culture, and to the word Mormon, and see it as a whitewashing of their own history. And so they don't agree, even though they're active and believing and participating in the faith, they're not necessarily in agreement that the church has taken this direction. You also, like I mentioned before, have members of a variety of churches, from the Community of Christ to fundamental Mormons to lots of other smaller entities who come from the Restoration movement of Mormonism, but again, they would not consider themselves LDS, and they would not be part of the mainstream church, and they would not name themselves as such. And then I also understand that even the church has made concessions for the use of the word Mormon in particular historical and educational circles. So, for example, we have degrees in accredited universities throughout the United States that have to do with Mormon studies programs. There are many Mormon historical societies. There are many groups that have gathered around political ideology that would use the name Mormon to identify themselves. So, when you're talking about journals and kind of data that has been collected by the national polls like the Pew Research Center, or if they're talking about Mormonism, especially historically, they're going to be using the term Mormon. So all of those things were assumptions I made going in that I realize now were mistakes. You know what they say about people who assume, right? So I definitely kind of made an ass of myself in some ways because I made assumptions I should not have made. The next point I want to make is that I saw this struggle. It really took like about 20 minutes of room participation to talk about the many feelings that this complaint brought up. It was brought up during my keynote address. And so as I sat back and kind of just watched that happen, which granted, I was sitting with my own discomfort, obviously, because I was like, oh no, like maybe I did make a mistake. How am I going to address this? I was also kind of also angered by the fact that I felt like my identity wasn't being, honored. There was a lot of mixed feelings for me, which is good. That means I have to do my own work. But it was also interesting to see the many mixed feelings within the room. And it made me realize how successful this Latter-day Saint campaign has been in regards to causing divides amongst the membership. It's yet one more marker, right? It's one more way to signal, are you in the group? Are you not in the group? And that can cause a lot of infighting, even within its own community. And I just felt like, boy, if we're infighting as professionals on this topic, I can't imagine the conflicts around this for members of the church and their families, So who's going to get mad about who's using what terms even this coming Thanksgiving dinner, which was kind of the point of my whole presentation, was these are issues we struggle with as professionals. The families we're serving are struggling with these issues as well. So whether intended or not, President Nelson, the current prophet of our church, who started this campaign, really kind of has contributed to family conflict around yet one more topic about whether or not we're going to comply with the current leader or we're not. The next point I just was thinking about is that, again, I was talking about my identity. So I was talking about me a lot of the time. It wasn't like I was just addressing Mormons in the third person. And I was talking as a minority in that particular group. I was an excommunicated member. Most of them were not. As a white Latina, I was a minority. As a woman, even though I think the numbers were fairly even in gender, I'm still a minority because in the church dynamics, there's power differentials regarding gender. So I was really coming at it too, like my history with the word Mormon matters here. And it made me think about this history that I have in my own membership with my church, where many times, because I was a convert kid, I lived out in what's called the mission field, meaning I was not ever really growing up in spaces where there was predominantly a Mormon community. I'm not going to lie, I was embarrassed sometimes to admit I was Mormon. That was embarrassing because, all the books in the history classes, would talk about the pioneer trek, and oftentimes polygamy would come up, and I was oftentimes teased as to whether or not I had more than one mom, and just a lot of those kind of microaggressions that I lived as a member of the church. And so to be able to stand up and say, no, I'm going to own this. This is my faith. This is my religion. These are my beliefs. This is what matters to me. I'm going to take a stand, and I'm going to say, yes, I am a Mormon woman or a Mormon young woman, was a big deal for me, back in the day, and to not be ashamed of that. And we grew up singing songs about being Mormon in primary, and I contributed through my tithing dollars to a multi-million-dollar campaign of, I am a Mormon, which I found to be really lovely, even though I'm not sure we should ever be spending multi-millions of dollars as church communities in advertising, but that's a different value system. So that was another thought I was having. Is it possible that I'm being microaggressive when in reality this is my identity? It also made me wonder, another point I was wondering is if we were this uncomfortable, if you were one of the therapists who was so uncomfortable with me bringing up that language, what would it be like for that therapist when a client brings up that language, when they identify with that language and don't comply to what the current church is asking for in that vocabulary confirmation. So that was another thought I had. And I do want to say that I do agree that if I had not been an LDS Mormon person myself, and I came to present on the topic to a religious, kind of group of people, and I had not made some either disclosures, or I had not done my homework, and was just using language that I had no business using, that would have been a microaggression on my part. And I can guarantee that if I would have been presenting even this presentation about how to work with a Utah population, but I would have been presenting to a majority of non-LDS or non-Mormon people, I probably would have made those disclosures much sooner, or right at the beginning. I did, another point, I had some attendees compare them wanting to be called Latter-day Saint, and that in fact, it was the initial comment, the person said, I feel like this is a microaggression. And then they went on to compare that, if a Black person wants to be called African American, or if an LGBTQ person wants to be called by their proper pronouns, and we didn't do that would be seen as microaggressive. So then what I was doing by not referring to everything in an LDS framework that I was talking about, then I was being microaggressive. So I sat with that, and I'll just be honest, I was very uncomfortable with this comparison, because I do know that Latter-day Saints have historically faced persecution, back in their beginning years. And we are often the brunt of many jokes in the media, and we're often misunderstood as a religion. So there's some distrust of Mormons, and that can be very difficult to be part of a group that is treated differently by your outer society. So I do understand that there is that wound there. Like I mentioned before, I have felt some of those pains and know what it's like to feel those microaggressions. At the same time, we are part of a Christian majority that enjoys many privileges as one, a primarily white denomination in this country, and also the many religious liberties we are afforded that actually directly discriminate against others, right? So BYU, for example, is allowed in this country to be an accredited, federally funded university that discriminates against LGBTQ folks. So I wasn't comfortable with that comparison, because I think that it did not, I don't think that Mormons or Latter-day Saints are dealing with the same type of systemic issues and discriminations that people of color are dealing with, whether in or out of the church, or that LGBTQ folks have been dealing with for decades. And we still have the number one reason why homeless youth are homeless in our state of Utah is because they're LGBTQ minors who've been kicked out of their homes. They're not supportive. They don't have affirming homes. So I felt very uncomfortable with that comparison. And I guess I would encourage my colleagues to be careful with what they are comparing certain microaggressions to other microaggressions on. I guess the last point I'll make is that I'll just share my own personal history with this name battle and what the church should be called. I do have bias, so I'm going to own it. I think that's part of repairing, is to own your bias. So my feelings about this are very mixed. I do understand wanting to emphasize Jesus Christ in the name of the church, right? And in our brand and in our identity. I think a lot of times Mormon people have not been considered Christian, regardless of what church group they're a part of. I think that that's been a sore spot for our Mormon history. I understand that that's important to be Christ-centered, and that would be a value that the church would have. At the same time, this has largely been a battle between certain church leaders, very high leaders, right? So just President Hinckley, who was a prophet not that long ago, had very different ideas about this than our current president, President Nelson. So even amongst high leadership, there has been a difference of thought on this. And I've been through this before, right? I remember when I lived in Wisconsin, there was like a year or two where we really pushed to use the full name of the church. And it kind of petered back, to using the term Mormon. I think it also has some struggles to change. It's one thing to change within the in-group. It's difficult to get the entire society who has known a certain ethnicity and culture, so that's just a battle. So I think that it's in some ways, I think it's kind of a silly battle, silly to get so caught up in this struggle. Because of the conflicts it causes. And because also, I do not believe that using the term Mormon, which is a cultural and ethnic term, is a win for Satan. Our own book of scriptures bears that name. The prophet Mormon is somebody who is revered in our religion. So I think that that's kind of provocative to kind of say those kinds of things. And I remember seeing one of the trails here that was renamed. Instead of the Mormon Trail, it was called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Trail. And that's actually historically inaccurate. It erases the experience of so many people. I mean, fundamental Mormons died on that trail. Fundamental Mormons who were sent to different countries to keep certain ordinances and priesthood keys alive while the US saints were dealing with the politics of the illegalities of polygamy, they came through on those trails. They would not call themselves members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I think it's a real dishonor to the history and to the many people that make up the cultural milieu and the richness and diversity of what it is to be on the Mormon spectrum. So I do have that bias, and I'm willing to own it. Like I mentioned before, I don't think that a church bearing Christ's name, any church, should be focusing so much money rebranding themselves instead of putting those monies for more dire circumstances that are happening all over the world, especially with some of the information we now know about how much monies this particular church has stored. So at the same time, even though I have that bias, here's what I will say. When I show up in a therapy room, I will always ask my client what language they prefer, and I will honor that language. And I will want to know why that language is important to them, because it is my job as a therapist to set those kinds of biases aside and to meet my clients in their social location and what matters to them. And I don't, even though I may think it's silly personally, I do not think it's silly for them. I think for them, it is very important. It is a part of their worship. It is a part of what is signaling, their commitment and their standards in regards to their beliefs in their faith community. I'll end this presentation by just sharing the microaggressions that I brought up in my presentation that I'm currently very worried about in the state of Utah, as well as many other places in this country that therapists are participating in, whether intentionally or not. So that's the problem with microaggressions, is that sometimes we're so biased, we're not aware that we're actually causing harm. So I brought these up. I said, assuming your client is heterosexual is a microaggression. Assuming your clients want to be sexual at all is a microaggression. Assuming your clients are in a dyadic couple or want to be in a relationship structure such as a marriage or romance is a microaggression. Assuming your clients want children is a microaggression. Assuming your clients hold certain political or religious beliefs, especially if they do say that they are Latter-day Saint or Mormon or Catholic, like those groups are non-monolithic, right? They come in many varieties. So you can't just assume that they will hold certain political or religious views because of one identity marker that they have shared with you. That can be a microaggression. Assuming that you know your client's pronouns, depending on how they're gender expressing. Assuming you know your client's libido or drive experience due to gender. So in other words, like assuming that males might have a higher drive, or assuming that like lesbians experience bed death, or anything that you assume you know about your client's libido or sex drive, and tying that to their gender. A lot of our intake paperwork or questionnaires or the artwork in our office or the lack of gender neutral bathrooms or things like that can be forms of microaggressions. And whenever we are dealing with microaggressions that are brought to us, then it's important to do repair work. So as part of my repair work, I want to say publicly, I don't know how to reach out to all these therapists that were listening to me, is that one thing I would do differently is definitely to have a slide at the very beginning, disclosing the use of my language and why I'm using the language in regards to those terms. regardless of where I'm at in my relationship with the church. I think that was a mistake on my part. I also will say that in the moment when this was brought up, I definitely had my own reaction. I had a reaction, an emotional reaction, and I'm not sure that I addressed the people who were bringing up these critiques with the same respect or honor or curiosity that I would hope I would be offered if I was bringing up a concern during a presentation. So I want to own that as well. So that is my little talk on a lot of things, microaggressions within the LDS Church, the nuances, the many nuances of how the church is currently named, how we're going through this transition of the name of the church, and how people are reacting to that, and how is that showing up in our families and in our therapy offices and in all of that. So I hope you have found this useful, and I'd love to hear from you as far as how you're dealing with some of these shifts and changes, either as a professional or in your own family systems if you're part of this community. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishkish say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Thousand years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishkishay benavo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishkishay benavo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.